the COVID-19 is not the major X event. It is the black swan triggering a larger X event. But let me clarify what an event is, because we can go back to the time of the sack of Rome back during the fall of the Roman Empire that invoked and set a dark age for Europe for over 400 years. At the time of 410, when the Visigoths sacked Rome, and Europe, demographic decline, chaos, political upheaval. In fact, the technological revolution, the steam revolution that was occurring in the Western Roman Empire at that time was completely destroyed by the continuous invasions, which that technology was 1710. So everything that was lost during the X event, the initial X event during the collapse of the Roman Empire, and we could take a quick look here of this first X event when Rome was sacked, right? Take a look here. It was right here with this triple alignment, this Saturn, Neptune, Pluto triple alignment occurring. So we could see that, right? We could see that alignment occurring very strongly here, and also in square aspects. So we do triple alignment, square aspect to Uranus. So you have that first alignment, and that is the first X event that can be historically documented, which basically shook up, destroyed, and pulverized the world's first superpower, set technology back hundreds of years. We didn't recover until about 1710 at the beginning of the first industrial revolution, right, which was steam power driven. So that's the first one. Now, what's interesting here is every X event is to work like clockwork, where we see unexpected major events that challenge the course of world history. So an X event occurs that have potent, often occurring during the second decade of that new century, that correlates with major outer planetary alignments. So you take those three factors, black swan event that sets off a larger event or a chain of larger events that set off an X event that has potent long-term global significance that changes and changes the course of history for the remainder of that century, right? And that happens like clockwork. So here's my evidence I want to present, okay? So you have the first one that occurred with the sacking of Rome, the collapse of the Roman Empire. Then you see the next one emerge with Justinian dynasty. The Byzantium Empire emerges. And at the same time it emerges, it goes through its first crisis, the Justinian plague that killed 24% of the human population.
Right.
Right? Okay.
Absolutely.
So you see these two outer planetary alignments occurring here. Let's take it another 100 years. Again, notice this is the first decade of this is the second decade of the 5th century, right? You have, actually it should be 411, my mistake here. Okay, there you go. Here's the quadruple alignment. So this was August 24th, 411. Jupiter, Saturn, quadruple conjunction occurring, right? In square to Uranus, where Neptune and Pluto are in square to Uranus. You see the sacking of Rome, followed up by the Justinian plague and the rise of the new Byzantium Empire that happens in late antiquity of the second decade of the 6th century. Right. Then you see again the rise of the Tang dynasty, the first true Chinese, right? China rises as a true superpower, the Tang dynasty. That rises June 18, 618. Take a look at this chart here. All right. So now I'm looking, now again, I'm seeing here the Jupiter-Pluto alignments. You don't always see triple conjunctions, but what you do see is the rise of an empire, the fall of an empire. You often see, the rise of the empire again. The next following 100 years in 711 in August which correlates with the Arab and Berbers under the basically the rise of the Muslim empire, where the caliphate overtakes, stretches from Saudi Arabia invades North Africa, and then penetrates and occupies Spain. So this is the European invasion by the Islamic Caliphate, the rise of a new empire, right? August 30th, 711 AD. Notice here again, Jupiter-Uranus conjunction occurring. You see, I mean, we could spend a lot of time on the aspects, but I just want to move along here. Then you see the decade, right?
We're losing you a little bit.
The second decade, hold on. You're
it's
losing
okay
me.
Now.
Are you losing me?
Well, there is sometimes an interruption, momentary interruption in your speech, but it's all right now.
Okay. You hear me now, loud and clear now?
Yes.
Okay. So the next, following the next decade, right, in 814, you see the rise of Charlemagne in the 800s, which he begins to unify Western Europe out of the remnants of the Dark Age left over by the collapse of the Roman Empire. And let me just put that here. And we see the Carolingian Renaissance, right? The death of, so this is the rise and death of Charlemagne, where we would see the splitting up of empires that resulted in kingdoms. So we see the collapse of the Carolingian Empire that basically was the vestiges of the lost rock collapse and become the beginning of kingdoms throughout Europe, right? We see that happen in the second decade. We follow that again, and we follow that again to the empire here, the Ottonian dynasty. Rise of the German state occur. So we see the rise of Germany under Saturn-Pluto conjunction, right? That happens in 912, again, in the second decade of the new century. Then 100 years later, we see new Viking empire emerges, right? Where you see the Vikings invade England and begin invading France and the rest of Europe. Now, there's a number of things going on. I'm just talking about the biggest event that was happening at that time. When the Vikings successfully invade Europe, it's a major, major game changer, right?
Absolutely.
Then we see, then we see again another 100 years later. We see the Knights Templar are founded to protect Jerusalem. So what's happening at this time in 1119, August 3rd, 1119, we see the rise of the Crusades. The Crusades reach their height. Founded. We see a new order in banking system established, right? And there's a whole host of other things that are happening at this time. So this continues again. We see this continue going on. And then at the height of the medieval period, or the high Middle Ages, right, in the early 1300s, we see the outbreak of the Great Famine. The Great Famine begins, hold on a second, March 13th, 315 to 318 period. But we see a Great Famine which begins the crisis of the 14th century. So the crisis of the 14th century begins, which later on sets the groundwork for what? The emergence of the Black
Death.
Time you saw Scotland, right? Scotland establishes independence with Britain. You see a number of geopolitical changes occurring on a massive scale. And notes here, Saturn, Pluto again. You're noticing not in every X event, but Saturn, Pluto tends to dominate most of these X events. When we go another 100 years forward in time into the second decade, right? And we see the Battle of Agincourt. This is the emergence. This is the emergence of England becoming a world power back in the 1500s. So it's really the power struggle between the two dominant world powers at that time. We're coming into a Thucydides trap power struggle between France and England. Okay. And
Absolutely.
again, there was other things going on, but this is like the most dominant headline for that period. Then we go another 100 years in the second decade, and then we see the High Renaissance period, where we see the Martin Luther begins his German Protestant Revolution, where he signs the 95 Theses on the cathedral wall, right? Saturn Pluto conjunction again. Okay. And then that emerges 100 years later in the second decade going forward. And I keep repeating that because I want everyone to get the point here. We see the 30 Years' War. Now, the 30 Years' War is significant, and it's something that many mundane astrologers downplay, because the 30 Years' War begins to break out during this period in 1618. It is considered the most destructive war ever fought, with massive population losses, both on a civilian and military scale, that was fought by multiple nations, greater than any war until, listen to this, until World War I.
Yes, indeed.
Okay. Okay. There was revolts all over the place. There was also an economic collapse. We see the Kippa and Unippa economic collapse, right? We see the breakup of the Holy Roman Empire. We see the collapse of the Ming Dynasty. I mean, I could give a list of things, and it was called the General Crisis by historians. The General Crisis. And the General Crisis, right, is a period, it's a term that historians use to describe a period of widespread global conflict and instability that occurs nearly every 100 years in Europe, in Asia, and throughout the rest of the world, since it was identified and labeled from the early 17th century onward. Okay, so you had the 30 Years' War and a number of other things occurring at the same time. Also during that time, there was a massive cold period, right? We saw the global average temperatures change. They went down, not global warming, as the astrologers say, global cooling, okay?
The outer minimum.
Yes, exactly. We're going to get to that. So you saw global deaths in conflicts. You saw demographic decline. And these now this is important. This is relative to what's happening now. So listen clearly. A series of events that occur during these global crisis periods, a series of events, black swan, highly improbable events that are happening right in front of us and escalating, highly improbable but possible events that are happening that trigger a systemic crisis between the masses and the state, between the masses and the government, between the states and the global economy. All right. Widespread breakdown in politics, widespread breakdown in economics, widespread breakdown in societal structures, societal institutions, a pervasive breakdown in government caused by a convergence of a complex series of demographic, cultural, economic, and political problems. Right? So we're seeing revolts, protests, political insurgency, social upheavals, military conflicts, soft coups d'etats, military coups d'etats, large-scale wars, and collapse of empires and rise of empires. And it correlates with drastic changes in the climate. Like in this case, we saw back in the 1300s with the general crisis of the 14th century during that 1315 to 1318 period with the Little Ice Age, right? Where we saw an abnormal spate of volcanic activity, followed by powerful earthquakes. Again, we saw that during this period in the 1600s, right? We saw, you go back 100 years forward, right? You go back 100 years forward again into the second decade, and you have, there was a number of things happening. We see the first Jacobite rebellion break out in Britain, and there was a number of other crises. But the next crisis in the 1800s, right, occurred, which was basically two things happened simultaneously. The French invasion of Russia, the French invasion of Europe, essentially, similar to what we experienced in the 40s with Germany. The French invasion of Russia and the United States and Great Britain going to war for the second time simultaneously. This had a massive impact on global markets, global trading, on a massive, massive scale, right? So, right, so then again, we go fast forward, Go up exactly 100 years later to August 1914, and that's when World War I breaks out. World War I breaks out, okay? Saturn-Pluto conjunction, August 4th, 1914. So we're seeing a series of black swan events breaking out. It correlates very closely, not every time, with Saturn-Pluto conjunctions or Saturn-Pluto with another set of outer planetary alignments occurring simultaneously. And what did we see in World War I? Let's just go back 100 years, because that's the world, the world of the 19th century, that world, that Pax Britannica world, right? Pax Britannica, 1815 and 1914 completely collapsed, starting August 1914, when we saw the end of major monarchies in Europe. The balance of power shifted from Europe and Great Britain to the United States, who became the dominant technological, economic, and military world power within months of that event. The beginning of the end for the European colonization, the galvanization and expansion of women's suffrage movement on a global scale, the rapid deployment and mass production methods of weaponized technology. We also saw a disruption of supply chains in that period across Europe, leading to famine. 11 million civilians, European civilians, died during that period. A good chunk of that had to do with famine. We saw, again, 9 million, so 9 million soldiers, but 11 million civilians died, all within a period from 1914 to 1918, a very short amount of time. We saw the Russian Revolution, Turkish Revolution, Mexican Revolution, Austro-Hungarian Revolution. We saw the Irish Revolution. And because of that revolution, we saw new nation states such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Estonia, Finland, Latvia, and Ukraine all emerge, right? And we saw an emergence of a new rivaling superpower. So the emergence of the United States as a superpower, right? Nobody knew that at the time. And no one knew at the time Russia would turn into the rivaling superpower of the 20th century, right? With the revolution. How many astrologers were saying that back at the time? Nobody, right? Because again, they were marginalizing the events and effects, right? So now let's go back to today. Today, if you just take that same approach, right, and you go here, by the way, this is, I just wanted to see the Great Famine. By the way, that late Middle Age Great Famine of the 1300s occurred when you saw Saturn-Pluto conjunction, okay? So I just wanted to reiterate that. And now we have the digital age of the COVID-19 global crisis, right? Look at this
yes.
quadruple conjunction. So you think things are going to go back to normal? Does anyone think that the prospect for a war between the United States and China is off the table? Any astrologist saying that is completely living in la la land at this point, because we're going to see an escalation in a geopolitical global economic breakdown, a weakening. Right now, look, in 6 weeks, we have Great Depression numbers in every area, every economic barometer and benchmark that are worse than at the height of the Depression in 1932, 1933, where there was an 8-day global financial reset when they closed all the banks. We have basically the damage, the social trauma due to massive unemployment is bigger now than it was in 1932. And it took 4 years to get there, 29, 30, 31, 32, 4 years, right? We're doing it in 4 weeks. And there's massive ecological upheaval. We have what do they call it? Colony collapse disorder. We see massive earthquakes, extreme weather, crop failures, right? We're seeing the second wave now, a relapse, like which happened in 1918 during the last X event period. Not only did we lose 11 million European civilians, 9 million soldiers, we lost over 50 million people at the same time worldwide to a pandemic, right? Again, nobody was talking about that. I mean, they were writing about it, but the astrologers of the day were not talking about that because they were so caught up with their little astrology here, looking at one or two aspects, not seeing it from the broader viewpoint. just like we saw disrupted supply chains in Europe, we're seeing disrupted supply chains across the globe, resulting in food shortages, resulting in component shortages. We're seeing the beginning of the end of the postmodern era that was established in 1945, the beginning of the end of globalism. We're seeing the galvanization of radical populist political movements. We're seeing the galvanization of the breakdown and decay of the European Union. We're seeing a radical establishment of parties. You see the radical ultra-liberal left and the alt-right emerging both in Europe, happening in Asia, and it's certainly happening in this election. You see the accelerated and rapid weaponization of artificial intelligence and the surveillance state all being rolled out. You're also seeing the actual, breakdown of relations, right? I mean, here's the other thing too. The Federal Reserve just injected $11 billion of monetary liquidity into not just the United States, worldwide, and the economy is still collapsing. We have 0 to -% interest rates worldwide, and the economy is collapsing still. We have U.S. debt to GDP ratio is now catching up to Greece within months. It used to be like around, a little under 100%. Now it's catching up to Greece or Italy. Well, Italy's even worse than Greece, but that's another story. We have 42 million people, or 35.4% of Americans in the most powerful, most dominant, most technologically competitive economy in the world that are unemployed. But nobody's talking about that, right? So I know some people are talking about it, but everyone's saying it's going to go back to normal. Moody's downgraded Italy down to junk status. Italy's debt to PD ratio is now 188%, right? Turkey's full apart. The German court ruled over the European Union's bond buying program, saying it was constitutional and they are no longer going to participate in it. And if they don't, if Germany pulls out, it's the end. We see tensions between the United States and Iran continuing, tensions between the United States and China hitting an all-time high. I mean, Trump and Xi are tweeting each other threats. Did you notice? They're threatening each other with tweets, okay? So, I'm telling you, we have a currency war with China, we have a trade war with China, we have a technology war with China, right? So all of this is happening now. So what is going back to normal going to mean? Oh, right? So that's the point I want to get across. And that's my argument, that this whole idea we're going to go back to normal. And by the way, everyone knows that the second wave of every pandemic, if you go back to the time, you take the horoscope of every pandemic back to the Justinian plague, which we have a date from, it's always the second wave that killed the most people, not the first one, the second one. And that's all correlating when this alignment, see this alignment here? Okay, when you just go out to September, let's just pop it to September real quick. Okay, right? During that time, you're going to have Mars, right? Mars is going to be, Mars is going to be essentially squaring off on that entire alignment. Look, so we have that triple alignment still in play. Mars was conjuncted during the first wave. The second wave and the second geopolitical economic breakdown on a global scale is going to happen when Mars triggers it again, and this is excluding this big eclipse that's going to be occurring on the world point. So no, this is not going back to normal. The astrologers need to grow up, realize they're not getting their pensions. The Eurozone's breaking down. We may be on the precipice of a global conflict on a global scale, like we saw during the century, we saw in the 30 Years' War, World War I, the Napoleonic War between England and France and America and Russia and everyone else, right? We're going to see this all replay out again. And that's my argument, that this isn't going back to normal.